Stoic! No! Comes a sound from outside the tavern. You hear hooves beating on the earth, wood splintering, and somebody straining and cursing in elven, orcish, and human as some struggle goes on. As it's quietened down, the doors to the tavern fly open, and dominating them is a massive half-orc with dreadlocks down at his sides and anger brooding on his face. He wears chainmail, he's got a shield slung over his shoulder, and he's absolutely bristling in his weapons. Around the tavern, some reach for their own weapons, others recall words of spells, and others look round, planning the easiest escape route, but the half-orc notices none of them. When somebody runs up and leaves a stool vacant, he sits down on the earth in front of the stool. In his left hand he's been cradling something. In his right hand he reaches into the saddlebags he dragged in, and pulls out a lantern, a hooded lantern, that he places carefully on the stool in front of him. Concentrating, his tongue sticking out slightly, he opens the doors of the lantern, and from his other hand you see that what he was cradling is a little purple flower, which he places now in the cavity in where the oil should be in the lantern. With his right hand he digs into another pocket in the saddlebags and pulls out a handful of damp earth, which he proceeds to pat down on the roots of the flower. And as he contemplates this flower, the anger in his face drains away, and it's replaced by one of joy, childish joy. But then suddenly he becomes aware of everybody else in the tavern and his own reputation, and he stands up and looks round, ready for a challenge. And as his eyes fall on the elves and half-elves in the group, his face absolutely lights up in joy, and then he looks suddenly embarrassed and uneasy. He starts pulling his dreadlocks over his neck, pulling up his collar to try to hide the vicious scars on his neck. Anyone who knows their orcish culture will know that these are battle scars and brands won for feats of brutality and bravery. A particularly prominent one that anyone with elvish or orcish would recognize is that of an elf killer. He looks over at the elf and the half-elves, and after taking a gulp, the half-orc pushes back his dreadlocks and steps forward. You have seen my elf killer brand, I see. Well, no, I have done nothing to earn this brand, except scream louder than the other whelps in the lair of Scarp's One-Eye when he was in the mood to torment his youngsters. No, I got this when I was 2 years old. I could no more kill an elf than I could read a book. I am Gel Amakir, brought up in the Grove of Weeping Pearl by Geneleth Half-Elven. And there is no evil in my heart towards elves. I respect and honor them. And I wish there to be no bad blood between us. Reaching into the dreadlocks, which you now notice are interwoven with ivy and flowers, he pulls out a little white flower which he offers to the elf. This is Oberon's wood iris, and I offer you it now as a sign of peace. So, this is how I introduce one of my D&D characters, Gel Amakir, the half-orc. Now, obviously it will change depending on circumstances. You have to improvise these things. But this is the idea I have. And once you have an idea, it's much easier to improvise, to change it, than if you're starting from blank and you have no idea at all what you're going to say. And for me, this is one of the most important things you need to prepare before coming into a first session. It's every bit as important as creating your stats and creating your equipment, because in a role-playing game, it's all in the imagination. And if you can't get across an image, an impression, a picture of what the characters are seeing, then actually it's almost like a mathematical game of probabilities where you're just comparing numbers. You need to create pictures in the head, and you do that through language. So I like to think about the first impressions my character will make in any campaign on the DM and the players. And I break this down into two parts. The first part is the physical description, and the second part is what the characters will say to strangers. Let's start with the physical description. Start with the most obvious, the race, the sex, and the approximate size. Move on from there to the most striking physical features about this character. It might be their actual physicality, things about them, girls' dreadlocks. It might be the color of the skin. It might be a scar or a tattoo that they're carrying. It might be that they have long yellow nails on their little fingers. It may be a huge mustache. Whatever it is, think of a distinctive physical characteristic, and also perhaps their clothes are the most distinctive feature. Shining armor is quite rare. A big flamboyant hat, an elaborate cloak, or a huge cloak which masks them so you can't actually see anything other than maybe a little lipsticked lips and a faint smile and a hint of a gold collar. Who knows? It's up to you. They can be memorable and physically distinctive, or they can be almost unnoticeable. That can also be interesting. That can also, if you describe it, it can create interest in your character, that you suddenly become aware of somebody who's been sitting there for 10 minutes, an hour, half a day. You're not sure how long he's been sitting there watching you, but now that dark shadow in the corner of the room you suddenly notice is occupied by somebody in a long cloak, with just his hands appearing on the table and a slight smile visible around his lips. However you do it, make sure that your first impression is one that people will remember. And then, unless you're playing in one of those rare campaigns where there's just one player and one GM, you'll need to work in a team. You'll need to work in a party. And in order to work in a group, you'll need to talk to them and think how that process will start. Don't just assume you'll be invited to join a group of the party, the group of characters. Think of a reason to be adventuring with them, and think how you will introduce yourself to strangers. We all in life have to meet strangers and introduce ourselves at times, and for some it's easier, for some it's harder. For Gel, for example, is an intimidating half-orc, and he thinks of ways to overcome that first impression. Maybe you're just a charming character and you can immediately launch into conversation with somebody. Maybe you're awkward and you have to play a little bit of a role. Whatever it is, think of your first words, possible first words, to interact with a group, because you will need to interact. Working with other players is vital to any game of D&D. Now, this is just my opinions on how to play, but I strongly believe that it's very important not just to think about your stats, but to think about how you describe everything in the game, because it's actually description that brings this game to life and makes it more than just a mathematical formula. So, that's all I'm going to say on my approach to preparation for playing. My name's Caius Wallen. I love D&D and I love role-playing games, and I encourage you to bring out the role-playing, the descriptive theatre of the mind that is in role-playing games. Check out Provoker's campaigns and the Winds of Sourceline, and basically lots of different games that are broadcast by members of the One Shot Group and the Brigade. I'd like to contribute my twopence worth towards their contribution to our great hobby. And I'll hope to see you again in another video.